Okay. Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. This is the lesson for Come Follow Me 2020, Book of Mormon 7, and it's covering 2nd Nephi 6 through 10. And I'm also backing up and covering a little bit of 2nd Nephi 1 through 4 as well. I usually do this in the class when we meet on Sundays because we go every other lesson. So I usually cover the previous week as well a little bit. So 2nd Nephi 1 through 4, we have Lehi acting as the patriarch at the end of his life, and he bestows and transfers the birthright and the father's blessing. So in chapter 1, Lehi blesses and admonishes Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and the sons of Ishmael and Zoram. In chapter 2, Lehi blesses Jacob with the father's blessing, and he summarizes the plan of salvation. In chapter 3, Lehi blesses Joseph, recapping the ancient prophecy concerning Joseph, who is his namesake, or the ancient Joseph, the one in Egypt. And then in chapter 4, Lehi blesses his grandchildren through Laman and Lemuel, and then he dies, and Nephi laments. So one of the things to notice in chapters 1 through 4, Lehi does not explicitly give Nephi a blessing. Instead, Nephi is conditionally given Laman's birthright in chapter 1 verse 22, 1 verse 29, which he takes over in chapter 5. Jacob gets the father's blessing from Lehi in chapter 2. Note in chapter 2 verse 3, he's set up to be the religious leader. This division is reinforced when Nephi consecrates Jacob and Joseph as priests and teachers, while Nephi acts as the king, which Nephi apparently does a pretty good job at according to Jacob 1, 9 through 11. So when it comes to birthrights and blessings, when you go back into the Old Testament, birthrights and blessings, the father doesn't have the right to hand out the birthright. The birthright always goes to the firstborn son. The blessing, however, is entirely up to the father. It's whichever child he chooses to bless with whatever blessing he decides. But the birthright always goes to the firstborn son. And this is something that's codified in the Law of Moses, and it was probably well before the Law of Moses as a tradition. And the premise on this is that the oldest son got a double portion by virtue of the birthright, because when the father died, who was presumably the patriarch, when the father dies, the oldest son gets a double portion because he has the responsibility to take care of everybody else who's still left, and that includes the widow. That includes any children who haven't married and moved off or assumed their portion of the inheritance, any daughters, any whatever. The oldest son has to bear that burden, so because of that, he gets more land and more stuff, more cattle, money, whatever. He gets the double portion because he has to support the rest of the family that his father was previously. So in this case, Lehi, he's not allowed to pick who gets the birthright because it's just never been that way. But he warns Laman that hey Laman, if you fall down on the job, it's going to go to Nephi. So Lehi recognizes the difficult reality that they face and sees that they're going to separate, or knows that it's inevitable, and he just basically warns Laman, and he says, hey man, dude, if you don't shape up and you're not keeping it straight, then Nephi's going to take over when you guys separate, and that ends up happening in chapter 5. So that's some of the background of what's happening there in 2nd Nephi 1 through 4. So on to, okay, so 2nd Nephi chapter 5, Nephites and Lamanites separate. The Nephites prosper. The Lamanites end up cursed, as predicted. And then we have this kind of potentially contentious issue in verse 21, where it talks about they were white. The Lamanites end up cursed with a skin of blackness. Now, for the Western readers, when we read something like this, to us it's just intuitively obvious that it's talking about skin color, because as a Western reader, an American, black and white is all about skin color. But to the Semitic reader, anciently, it absolutely had nothing to do with with skin color at all. A black skin had everything to do with sinful nature and being cursed. So if we compare some of the contemporaneous texts, like if we take a look at Jeremiah 8:21, Jeremiah 14:2, and especially Lamentations, which was written by Jeremiah, Lamentations 4:7 through 8, we have all these passages have a very similar white versus black imagery being employed, and Nephi is using a similar meaning here. And the term in Hebrew, now obviously we don't have the Book of Mormon text, so we don't know there what he was using, but in the Old Testament, the Hebrew term used there is kedar, which is defined by Strong's Dictionary as to be ashy, dark colored by implication, to mourn, as in sackcloth or sordid garments, to be blackish, be made darken, or heavily, or cause to mourn. So this has nothing to do with skin color. In Jeremiah, it has nothing to do with skin color at all. This has everything to do with being spiritually darkened, in the dark. The problem here is that there are a number of passages in the Book of Mormon that talk about the whole black thing, and the context really does suggest skin color. And then we look at the whole history of the way the Book of Mormon's been interpreted, and all of this, and we look at Native Americans and their having a darker skin tone and all this stuff. But clearly, Native Americans are not black. So I have a really tough time reading this as literal, owing to the context and what's going on. And I mean, we as Western readers, particularly Americans, because of the culture that we live in and our knee-jerk reaction to interpret the terms white and black, the skin color, we have to be very cautious of that and put it into the Semitic context that Nephi was writing in. Nephi was not a Western American. He's not thinking like us. He's not thinking about slavery. He's not thinking about race issues or any of that kind of stuff. His mindset and his context is going to be much closer to what Jeremiah was writing about, who was a contemporary to them. Okay, anyway, so let's take a look at 2 Nephi 6 through 10. Here we have Jacob's prophecy, and Jacob is talking about how we, the Lehites, are a remnant scattered on the isles of the sea, as predicted by Isaiah. He very much wants to make that connection with the audience and say, hey, guys, Isaiah talked about this happening. He talked about Israel being scattered. He talked about them going out to the isles of the sea. Hey, that's where we are. That's us. Isaiah is talking to us. So Jacob really wants to make that connection to the audience. And he's saying we need to be righteous in order to be brought back, as prophesied by Isaiah. And then Jacob's plan of salvation summary is very similar to the one that Lehi gave about 10 years earlier. So if you compare 6, 8, and 1, 4, quite similar. And then if you compare 6, 9 through 15 and 1, 10 through 12, very similar. And then if you compare 9, 25 and 2, 12 through 13, those are paralleled. And then chapter 10, verse 10 through 19, and compare that with chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. So clearly, Jacob's presentation is very much influenced by what his father Lehi said to him at the end of his life, and he carries that through in the lecture to his fellow Lehites. And then Jacob casts 10 woes onto the Nephite sinners, telling them to repent. And then Jacob refers to these awful monsters, death and hell. Jacob's awful monsters are, which he refers to in chapter 9, verse 10, verse 19, and again in verse 26. This is very closely connected to the Isaiah quotes that Jacob makes in chapter 7, verse 2, and chapter 8, 9 through 10. So Isaiah is talking about this awful monster, and Jacob wants very much for the audience to make that connection between Isaiah's awful monster and the one that he's talking about, death and hell. So Jacob is very much likening Isaiah to them. He's saying, look, this is us, it's talking about us, and he's interpreting the text for them so that they can understand more clearly what Isaiah is talking about. So Jacob's lecture probably occurs during one of the ingathering feasts required by the law of Moses, as Jacob explicitly mentions he was requested to speak by Nephi, and it spanned a couple of days, which is referenced in 9:54 through and 10:1. So if they're getting together, and Jacob has this long period of time to lecture the people, then it kind of suggests that everybody's there. Everybody knows they're in for a long lecturing. It kind of fits this context. And then in chapter 11, verse 1, Nephi tells us that there's other stuff that Jacob said that he didn't write down. So this is a lot of talking, and so it suggests that the people were in for a long event. So my guess is that it was Sukkot or Tabernacles, as it's the remembrance of the wandering in the wilderness, the revelation of the Torah, and it starts with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So that's just my guess. It could be any one of them, or it could have just been a long weekend. Who knows? So here are some notes as we go through the text, some things that kind of stuck out to me. Where did Jacob's ordination come from? We know in the Old Testament that the priesthood followed the lineage of Levi, and it went through patriarchally through firstborn sons of Aaron. That's the Kohen. But there's nothing in the text to suggest anybody there, like either Zoram or Ishmael, were lineage of Aaron. So how in the world did they do the whole priesthood thing? We have no idea. There's just nothing in the text. As the text goes on, it appears to be patriarchal from Jacob through. Lehi appears to have directed that by telling Jacob that, giving him the father's blessing, that he would be the spiritual leader, and it seems to go from father to son. Aside from that, we have no details. Some other things, we hear nothing about Sariah in 2nd Nephi. I just kind of assume that she dies somewhere late in 1st Nephi, as she's not accounted for in the division between the Nephites and Lamanites in chapter 5, verse 6. We hear no more about Sam or Joseph from here on out in the plates. There are no Samites mentioned in the list that Jacob gives in chapter 1, in Jacob 1:13. So did Sam only have daughters, or did he have no children? We don't know. They just, you know. We also find out that Nephi had sisters in chapter 5, verse 6, but we don't ever hear anything else about them, unfortunately. Nephi references the brass plates and the large plates, pretty much assuming that the reader has access to them, but we don't. So we're missing a lot of context and history that Nephi takes for granted when he's writing the small plates, which we just don't have, which is unfortunate. I mean, I'd love to know some of these details, but we just don't have it. And so there you have it. Okay, so that's it for lesson 7.